Well, I want to introduce you to Dr. Noble if you don't know who he is already. Dr. Noble grew up actually in Lancaster, California, and attended Antelope Valley College, where he met his wife, Brittany. They now have 3 kids, 12, 10, and 7. Their names are Eleanor, Quentin, and Francis. So Dr. Noble actually got his master's degree in English from Baylor. Okay, I knew there'd be somebody out there from Baylor. I just want to read to you some other things that Dr. Noble did while he was in California. He tutored high school felons at a probation camp, substituted at various high schools, helped produce, write, rap, and engineer and record 2 hip-hop albums. That gives him some credibility right there. Taught composition and literature at Antelope Valley College, where he went bald and got married, in his own words. In fall of 2014, he and his wife moved to Shawnee, Oklahoma, where Dr. Noble accepted a position as Associate Professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. He gets asked to write for many websites and to come on and do interviews for many broadcasts. He's written for Christian publications such as Modern Reformation, Christianity Today. He's written for secular publications such as Vox, BuzzFeed, and The Atlantic. He's been interviewed or quoted on the New York Times, Washington Post, MTV, and he's here to talk about church and culture and how the two intersect. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Noble.
It's a very big stage. It's going to take me a while to get here. All right, I think I heard there were some homeschoolers here. Do we have any homeschoolers? Yeah. I was homeschooled all the way. Yeah, don't let that discourage you, but it's a wonderful thing. Homeschooling is wonderful. I highly support it. I'm going to ask a lot of you tonight, not necessarily intellectually asking a lot of you, but the argument that I'm going to unfold for you is at least emotionally taxing. And I want you to bear with me because it's going to end with the gospel. So it's not going to be hopeless. But I want us to take a serious look at the society that we live in, and that is going to require us to see things clearly. So the first thing I'm going to argue is that the contemporary world, at least in the West, that's where we live, is not designed for humans, or at least humans as God made us. All societies are formed with some idea of what it means to be a human being. You can't establish laws, codes, language, arts, culture without some vision of what a human being is and what they are for. And that's fascinating because if you were to begin with a false conception of what it means to be human, therefore, people would live in a kind of angst or anxiety. You would feel like you were living in an alien environment, and people will suffer. To understand this, I want to talk about, speaking of Baylor, I want to talk about the Baylor Bears, the actual Bears, not the basketball team. I won't talk about the football team. Basketball team, they won a men's championship a couple of years ago, so I taught there for a couple of years while I was working on my PhD, and so I feel like I'm part of the winning tradition at Baylor, even though I was not there when they won. In any case, they have actual bears at Baylor, if you have not visited. They have one bear, a lady. Joy passed away recently, but they had 2, Lady and Joy. And when I was a graduate student there, I would take my young daughter and young son to go visit the bears. They have this beautiful habitat, and so we would go for walks on the lovely campus and look at the bears and take them in the stroller back home. It was a lovely experience. This habitat wasn't always lovely, though. As I understand it, the origin of these live bears on campus is that some college students somehow got a bear. I'm not sure how that happens. And they were keeping this bear in their backyard until Baylor found out about it and said, okay, we need to take charge of this. And they made what's called a bear pit. And the bear pit is still what the student section, cheering section in Baylor basketball games is called, the bear pit. And it was essentially a pit, a concrete pit for these bears to live in. It had a pool, but it was still very concrete, very not appropriate environment for a bear. Later in 1976, they upgraded, but it really looked like an above-ground swimming pool made out of concrete, more like a prison than a habitat for bears. And in fact, they had astroturf down, so fake grass and concrete. And then in 2005, they construct the habitat that I saw. And I want to read to you some of the language that they used as they were designing this place. They said, the new habitat will enhance bears' living environment and provide a home more like their natural habitat. So I want you to notice that. The intention is to create the habitat that is most natural for bears. Another quote. The director of the Baylor Chamber of Commerce, the current bears habitat was constructed in 2005 with the intention of a, quote, bear's dream world, which seems it's a very high standard when you're creating a bear habitat. It's a 2,000 square foot facility featuring 3 caves, a waterfall, 3 wading pools, a night house, and more. It is rated for a Category 5 hurricane. It's very impressive. And it's the safest place on campus, unless the bears were hungry and you were in there. Then it would not be so safe. It's accredited for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. It's a Class C zoo, so it's licensed. That's very impressive. As far as their food, they have the best care available to our bears, which includes but not limited to in-depth meal planning with nutrition specialists. The bears enjoy a wide range of fresh, raw meats, fruits, and vegetables. And after all this inflation, that sounds very extravagant. And it was very extravagant for me as a graduate student because I lived in graduate student housing, which was not 2,000 square feet. Did not have wading pools. It did have a kind of waterfall because the bathtub on the second floor would leak a little bit to the first floor. Not quite the same thing. We couldn't quite afford fresh fruits and vegetables and raw meats. Nevertheless, it was definitely not the safest place on campus, which is fine. But when I took my kids to observe these bears, we always saw the same thing. The bears would be pacing in circles. And at this point, they had real grass, no more astroturf. They had real grass. That's impressive. But the grass had paths cut into it where it was worn down to the dirt because the bears would be compulsively walking in circles. And you've seen this before at zoos, lions, bears, other animals that are not meant to live in captivity, yet they are in captivity. And so they walk around compulsively. There's a name for this, not the official term, but it's a useful term called zoochosis, a psychosis of captive animals. I think there's a lesson here to be learned. Here were these millions of dollars were spent to create the bear's dream world. All the best experts on bears, I don't know what kind, black bears or brown bears, I'm not a bear expert, went into designing just the right space for these bears to live. And yet, they were sick. They were sick. It was designed for bears, but it was not designed for bears as they actually are. That's my point. Not as they actually are. Actual bears are not the kind of creatures that can flourish in a cage. That's the problem. No matter how well you design the cage. Now, eventually, through breeding and training, you might be able to adapt the animal to a false environment, but we know that at that point, it's no longer really a bear, it's a bear raised in captivity. And we have those signs in zoos, right? Because there's a difference. We do this with many animals. We create a kind of different animal. Now, I'm not going to argue that we are caged in a zoo, Class C cage, zoo or otherwise. Yet I don't think it's wrong to say that we live in a habitat that was not designed appropriately for humans. And I think we share a kind of zoochosis, a kind of anxious, tiring, bored, endless pacing, a weariness, a feeling that we are trapped and out of place. But wait a minute, Alan, you might be thinking. I actually know quite a few people who live happy, content, and interesting lives. The society you just described sounds nothing like their daily experience. And yet, I wonder if you take their phones, computers, televisions, podcasts, exercise classes, 80-hour work weeks, shopping sprees, planners away from them for an hour or more, would they not begin to feel the weight of their own existence closing in on them? Would they not begin to worry, to feel a constricting anxiety, a fear of missing out, of falling behind, of wasting away? Would not their conscience begin to call up memories of failures and doubts and insecurities? Thankfully, the modern world is perfectly designed for a people that are afraid of being themselves, being by themselves. Smartphones, in some way, weren't designed to be addictive against our wills. We wanted to be addicted to screens because a screen into another world is a much safer, much safer than a mirror reflecting our own. A screen can divert our attention from the disorder right in front of us, in our own hearts, even if it means diverting us with news of even greater disorder across the globe. So how many of those who seem to be living interesting lives are only able to get out of bed in the morning because of the momentum of life, because they have a job or a school or something to do? How many of those who seem to be living fulfilling lives are merely filling their lives? I don't doubt for a minute many people in America have stimulating, pleasurable, and comfortable lives, but so do many cats and dogs. And if humans are distinct from animals, and we are, then stimulation and pleasure and physical comfort are wholly inadequate measures of the good life. Please don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that everyone is absolutely miserable beneath the surface, but I do think a lot of us are anxious, and there's data to back this up. A lot of us are lonely, tired, bored, overwhelmed, and tired again. The model for many contemporary people is something like, I just need to get through the day. I just need to survive. And to cope with this, to survive, a lot of us are self-medicating. I think almost all of us self-medicate now. If you expand the definition of what self-medication is. For example, some drink, some take prescription antidepressants or stimulants or anti-anxiety meds, which absolutely have their place. Some eat, some binge watch Friends, some work more, some work out more, some cut themselves, some immerse themselves in the news, some immerse themselves in porn, some play video games, some shop, some sleep, some become K-pop stans. Some scroll endlessly through Instagram, some post endlessly on Twitter, some argue online, some obsess about their health, some obsess about the environment, some protest online, some protest to be famous online. Some travel, some attempt suicide, some attempt self-improvement, some abuse people, some join extremist movements, some join multi-level marketing programs, kind of similar things. Some take up yoga, some take up gambling, some participate in extreme sports, some participate in illicit romance. Some daydream about being diagnosed with a disease that will justify their mediocrity. Some invest in self-care, some invest in bitcoins, maybe not so much now. Some discover a new identity, some modify their bodies, some modify their diets, some embrace victimhood, some embrace mocking victimhood, but we all seem to medicate because if we don't, we're not sure that we can get through the day. Now, if that sounds pessimistic about the modern quality of life, I want to consider a couple of growing trends in our country. I want to focus mostly on mental illness. Among particularly young Americans, there's been a dramatic increase in mental illness diagnoses. College campuses where I work have been ground zero for these issues, but most schools have failed to keep up with the demand. In my own experience as a professor, students suffering from mental illnesses are not snowflakes. On the contrary, many of the ones I've met I've had to urge to take advantage of our school's mental health services because they'd prefer to keep their problems to themselves and muscle through even as their lives are falling apart. Young people are torn up over broken families, childhood abuse, anxiety, depression, loneliness, dread that they'll never amount to anything, imposter syndrome, choice paralysis, porn addiction, and on and on. One survey found that nearly 43% of undergraduates felt, quote, so depressed that it was difficult to function in the past year. And 64% said they felt overwhelming anxiety. Between scholarly research on the mental health crisis in college campuses and my own experiences, I've come to assume that in any class that I teach, several students will be suffering from diagnosed mental illness, others will be survivors of sexual abuse, and many will struggle with depression, anxiety, and aimlessness. While the rise in mental illness diagnoses can be partially explained by heightened awareness and decreased taboos, that isn't the whole story. Something has changed. Our kids are not all right, and the rest of us aren't doing a whole lot better. According to the CDC, between 2011 and 2014, almost 13% of people aged 12 and above took antidepressant medication in the past month. The widespread use of psychiatric medication led one historian of psychiatry to remark, I believe this was in the New York Times, "We've come to a place, at least in the West, where it seems every other person is depressed and on medication. You do have to wonder what that says about our culture," end quote. More alarming is the trend of declining life expectancy in America. In November of 2018, the CDC director released a statement saying that tragically this troubling trend is driven largely by deaths from drug overdoses and suicides. And that trend of a declining life expectancy has only continued. Life expectancy in America is going down, which is unheard of in industrialized countries until us. A significant segment of the American population finds life unbearable. Some cope with medication, but others turn to opiates and suicide. In their carefully researched study of declining life expectancy, economists Ann Case and Angus Denton repeatedly point to the loss of meaning experienced by less educated Americans who have experienced the loss of fulfilling work, marriages, churches, and communities. We're not doing well. Another sign that we're not doing well is this. In 1990, only 3% of men said they had 0 friends. That's not bad. 3% of men said they had no close friends. In the year 2021, 15% of men said they had no close friends. Now, according to math, that's a 5 times increase, I believe. I teach English. But I believe that's accurate. In my opinion, it's very difficult to get through life without close friends. I want to give a very different example of the kind of sickness, the kind of pacing, the kind of zoochosis that we experience. I read a fascinating article in the Harvard Business Review, and it was a survey of the American workplace. They asked employees the kind of perks that they wanted, the kind of improvements that they wanted in their workplace. Not the benefits, not like healthcare packages and things, but in your workplace. What do you want to improve the quality of your workplace? And over a third of employees felt that they don't get enough natural light in their workplace. That was the number one thing, over a third. Which is fascinating to me and a little depressing, because natural lighting, speaking of natural things, seems like something we shouldn't have to ask for. We should just have natural lighting. But what was particularly fascinating to me about this was that later in the article, as they're explaining why employees want this natural lighting, this is written to employers, and they're arguing for employers to give their employees natural lighting. What do you think was the motivation? What's their appeal? Why did they say you should give your employees natural lighting? Anybody have any idea? Productivity, that's right. We know this, right? Like, you don't even have to read the article. You know this. Why? Because we've seen this done all over the place. Why is it that we have to justify doing something humane by productivity? By saying something is more efficient. What if it's not more efficient, it's just good? Efficiency is tied to this idea of technique. that is everywhere in our society. We live in a society governed by technique, and it conditions us to believe that life is easier than it's ever been. Technique, if you're not familiar with the way I'm using this term, technique is the use of rational methods, so you use reason to maximize efficiency. And we see it actually everywhere. If this sounds academic, it's not. It's incredibly practical, and you have this all over your life. For example, time-saving technology is an example of technique. Apps that maximize your workout based on your body type and age and how much time you have during the day is an example of technique. Scientifically proven methods for parenting, working, eating, shopping, budgeting, folding clothes, sleeping, sex, dating, buying a car, studying, everything. Those are examples of technique. When I was writing this book, I loved to sleep on my side, but my shoulder just kept aching. And so I did what anyone does, as I'm getting older, I have to do these things. I Googled, why does my shoulder hurt when I'm sleeping on my side? And Google gave me the answer. And the answer was an article that told me the best practice for side sleeping. It turns out there is a technique for sleeping on your side. And I had been wasting my life, injuring myself, sleeping wrong. If you want to know, it's this. So you got the pillow here, and it's like that. So, pro tip. The promise of technique has a promise, and its promise is that we are collectively overcoming all the challenges of life through research, technology, and discipline. All you have to do is find the right self-help book, or the life hack, or app, or life coach, or devotional, and then your problems are solved. The problem is a problem of technique, in other words. But technique's promise that life is easier than ever turns out to be just another source of dread and shame. If life doesn't have to be this hard, if there are answers and methods and practices that can solve all my problems, then it's really my fault that I'm overwhelmed or a failure. Sure, political systems can be corrupt. Nobody's perfect. Some people are born with genetic advantages that we don't have. But we have methods for overcoming these obstacles. There's always another technique I can use to beat the system, improve myself, and compensate for my biology. So if I am not living to my full potential, if I'm not the best version of myself, I'm to blame for not taking advantage of these methods. Why all this suffering? Why all this suffering? What if at the core of this all is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be human? I want to look at some specifics to understand this. Some of you here today have been described as high achievers. Although you might not be comfortable with that label because you know that you're actually not all that adequate. It's true that you set high standards for yourself, high goals. When you fail at something, it hurts a lot. You may feel anxious or inadequate or afraid or bitter when you fail. But if you are here this evening, you're probably the kind of person who learns from your mistakes. You're always discovering new ways to improve yourself, to grow, become more efficient, to practice new techniques, to become what we might call the best version of yourself. You excel at your career or your studies or your art or your hobby or your sport or whatever it is. You know that your mindset and your actions are the keys to your future, and you work hard to perfect them. Although you're too smart to believe that you can be whatever you want to be or achieve the ideal life, you do see the world as split between those who hustle and go after their dreams and are mostly successful, and those who are self-defeated and fail and make excuses, which means that your challenge in life is to belong to the first group. Now, a subset of this group of high achievers walk around with low-grade anxiety all the time. It gnaws at you. Every successful, beautiful person you meet reminds you of your inadequacy. Every time you try to rest or take a break, or take a nap, you feel guilty. You can only nap if you think when you wake up you'll be more efficient. You only feel a kind of peace when you exhaust yourself from work. You complain about how little sleep you get, but you wear that suffering as a sign of your seriousness. I said low-grade anxiety, but that's not quite accurate. You walk around with low-grade anxiety, but there are seasons or episodes when it's more than low-grade. It's a panic attack. It's the inability to get out of bed. It's depression, shame, dread, ennui. Only a few friends and family members know how bad you can get, and almost no one outside of that small circle knows that anything is wrong. Your coworkers think you are highly successful, that you, unlike them, have your life together. But not everyone is a high achiever. Some of you are frankly done. You're done with this whole game of adulthood or life or whatever this mess is. You know that the world is a highly competitive place, and frankly, you can't compete. The game is rigged, and you know it. You've been told all your life that the future is wide open for you, but you know that's a lie. When you were a kid, your teachers lied to you because telling little kids that they can achieve their dreams improves their test scores on state-mandated tests. That's it. It's a convenient, effective, profitable lie. Yes, the system works for some people, you think, but what really separates the winners from the losers is how wealthy your family is or whether your parents stay married. You look at the high achievers and you know that their real achievement was just a privilege, being born to a wealthy family, being born a certain gender or race or with natural beauty or athleticism or intelligence and so on. And since you don't have those advantages, all you have left is to distract yourself, and you do. You binge watch TV shows, you watch porn, you drink, you play video games for hours on end, you endlessly scroll through social media, you compulsively shop for things you don't need, whatever. The point is, you know that you'll never be successful and you're done caring. You stop showing up to class or work or social events. What I want to argue this evening is that both the high achievers and those who are done, I want to call these the affirming and the resigned, suffer from the same fundamental lie that you are your own and you belong to yourself. This is the false anthropology that our society is built upon. The false idea of what it means to be a human being that the structures of our society have been built upon. So long as you begin from that premise, whether consciously or unconsciously, you will eventually gravitate towards despair. Nearly everyone here who is high achieving is either hiding their burnout and anxiety, teetering on the edge of collapse, or they will hit a wall soon where their abilities don't measure up and they're not good enough and they don't know what that means for them as a person. From the belief that you are your own, all roads lead to a crack up. If you're in college, maybe it's your senior year or grad school, or when you look for a job, or when you become a parent or get a promotion. You see, the problem with the affirming is not that they haven't figured out a healthy work-life balance. It's not that they need to focus on self-care. The problem with the resigned is not that they lack self-esteem or self-confidence or a growth mindset. It's not about trying too hard or not trying hard enough. It's underneath all of those things. The problem is that you have been trained to believe that your life is your own, that the shape and significance of your existence is entirely up to you and entirely your responsibility, which sounds liberating, but it's actually a kind of hell. As John Milton's Satan tells us, it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Self-sovereignty, belonging to yourself, is the hell that we choose. If you don't see yourself in any of these descriptions, I'd invite you to pay close attention. Interrogate yourself later this week. Observe the things that make you anxious, that depress you. Observe how you deal with stress and what makes you feel confident and happy. We usually tell on ourselves. Now, assuming most of you are Christians in this room, you may be thinking to yourself, Mr. Noble, I'm sorry, I don't believe that I belong to myself. My identity is in Christ. You're preaching to the wrong audience. And my first response, my main response would be, please, my father was Mr. Noble, call me Dr. Noble. Second, it's my best joke. Second, ideas are insidious. Bad ideas can worm their way into our hearts like the snake in the garden. Even if you know the right things, sometimes we believe the wrong things. My point here is merely that if you hear this idea that we are our own and belong to ourselves, and you imagine that it's a secular idea for people out there, outside the church, who are ignorant rather than a deep and pervasive societal force that affects virtually all of us, then I think you're mistaken. So where does this idea come from? I think it comes from nearly every corner of our lives. We've been given a promise. You are the author of your story. You are the only one who can define your identity, your purpose, and your values. This is your life. Other people can give you advice. They can model for you how to live well, how to have the good life. They can post images on Instagram of what it looks like to be happily married, or to have a great job, or an exciting and enviable adventures with your friends, or to have really holy, quiet time with God each morning. But they can't tell you how to live your life. To be a human is to have the radical and exciting duty of discovering meaning for yourself. So the promise is, if you accept the responsibilities of belonging to yourself and strive to be the best version of yourself, then you will be well-adjusted, fulfilled, rewarded, happy, and successful. What do I mean by the responsibilities of belonging to yourself? If we are our own and belong to ourselves, then there are at least 5 major aspects of our lives that we bear on our shoulders: justification, identity, meaning, value, and belonging. Each of these have profound implications for our lives. For example, if you have to decide what justifies your life, makes your life worth living, gives you purpose and direction, that is your duty if you belong to yourself. You have to figure that out. Why you deserve taking up oxygen and the Earth's limited resources, and why it's worth putting up with daily suffering. Other people can give you ideas about what your purpose is, but the final authority belongs to you. If you don't decide what makes your life worth living, what justifies you, then no one will. As you can imagine, the responsibilities of self-belonging will lead you to feel exhausted, depressed, overwhelmed, burned out, lonely, inadequate, and uncertain. And that's how a lot of us feel. Here's a quote from the poet, American poet Christian Wyman. He says, "Anxiety comes from the self as ultimate concern, from the fact that the self cannot bear this ultimate concern. It buckles and wavers under the strain, and eventually, inevitably, it breaks." This has many implications, but the overall issue is that our lives are now projects or journeys or quests that we and we alone are responsible for fulfilling or making worthwhile. Again, those responsibilities are justification, identity, meaning, value, and belonging. And I just want to focus on one of these right now. I want to focus on, I think, maybe the most significant one for many of us today, and that is identity. I think most Christians would readily tell you that they find their identity in Christ, and yet they still spend an inordinate amount of time, energy, and anxiety trying to discover who they are and express that identity to the world. That they, like everyone else, feel that their identity is tenuous, that it's uncertain, indefinite, vague, that it lacks substance, that it needs constant, vigilant expression and reinvention in Instagram posts and new clothes to be real and meaningful. In other words, we feel like our identities are kind of liquid. They're shifting under our feet. And the only way to feel like you know who you are is to express yourself loudly and constantly and in more detail, which is what social media is. And if you go too long between social media posts, you may feel like you are disappearing. Now, society will help you meet this particular responsibility of self-belonging. Society has created an expanding number of techniques, technologies, and methods of publicly defining and expressing your identity. Think about social media, for example, how each platform adapts, how it introduces new ways of posting and expressing yourself. It's not a coincidence that it's highly profitable for corporations if people feel uncertain about their identity. It drives us to spend ridiculous amounts of time online, money on clothing and cars and so on. Society recognizes that we need to be each our own person, and it gives us tools, and these tools claim to help us accomplish this goal, help us bear the burden of identity. But they always leave us feeling inadequate. They always make us addicted. And in fact, they introduce to us a greater sense of competition. Now, it's not just social media and young people either. I want to be clear about that. People who aren't on social media have other tools of self-expression to try to ground themselves. Middle-aged people are more likely to buy a car or a house or have an affair or strut around in the gym. But it's the same fundamental thing. One reason we can't actually build an identity for ourselves if we belong to ourselves is that identity necessarily, follow this, identity necessarily requires a witness, somebody out there who sees us. And that puts us in a ridiculous position where on the one hand, as people who belong to ourselves, we will loudly proclaim that no one can judge us, no one can define us, or put us in a box. But we absolutely need affirmation from other people to feel like we are alive. And we'll take that affirmation even if it comes in the rather pathetic form of likes, shares, and follows. As I said, these techniques or methods for creating our identity, they always end up reminding us of our inadequacy because everyone else uses the same tools. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. Everyone is trying to feel known and alive and affirmed, to have their identity feel certain and approved. We're all competing for the same attention, the same likes, the same affirmation, the same eyes and love and desire. And guess what? No matter how good you are, someone is better. Someone is more attractive. It turns out that the internet reminds us daily a lot of people are better than us, are more worthy of people's attention or desire or affirmation, so what chance do you stand? And that brings us back to the beginning, to the way of affirmation and resignation, the two primary ways we cope of living in a hyper-competitive society. The affirming believe that the system basically works, that if you try hard enough and you stop making excuses for yourself, you can use the tools society has given you to improve and self-optimize, and then you can win. There are Christian and non-Christian versions of this. Pray harder, read your Bible more, exercise, get more sleep, and so on. The resigned cope by giving up. There are ways of giving up and living an interesting and pleasurable life in modern America. Now, one of the main differences between the affirming and the resigned is that the affirming have a socially acceptable coping mechanism. They can do things like retail therapy, where you shop, and as long as you can afford it, that's socially acceptable. Whereas the resigned often do things like play video games for 10 hours, and that's deemed to be socially unacceptable. But both are addictive, and neither addresses the heart of the matter. Okay, so if the way of affirmation and resignation are wrong, what's left? That's the question. What's left? As I said, I believe both of these attitudes are a response to the unbearable burden that society has placed on us, the responsibilities of self-belonging. And unless we address that, unless we see that we do not belong to ourselves, and we can't belong to ourselves, and belonging to ourselves is literally killing us, until we accept that, everything we do will be vanity. A coping mechanism that leaves us lonely and addicted and feeling even more inadequate. I think you can do three things personally. First thing you can do is label a lie a lie. Call it what it is. Observe the snake in the garden whispering into your ear that you are your own and everything is your responsibility. See it. Recognize when a corporation or a social media platform or a celebrity is trying to profit off of making you feel inadequate, convincing you that your existence and meaning and purpose hinges upon your merit, on the identity that you can create, and you have to create it because no one else is going to do it, so you'd better start now. Second, you can remind yourself of what is basic and true. The Bible is filled with commands to remember. Remember what God did in the wilderness. Remember Christ's sacrifice. Remember your baptism. Remember your death. Remember the resurrection. And remember that, as 1 Corinthians 6:20 tells us, you are not your own. You belong to God. And because you belong to Him, your life is good. Your existence is a gift from God. There's one being who knows you completely and loves you completely. Do you remember the problem of identity I just talked about a couple of minutes ago? Identity always requires a witness. But if your existence is self-sustained and autonomous from the judgment of other people, you can never truly have an identity. You're always going to want more and more and more and more people affirming your identity. It'll never be enough. It becomes an addiction. But how about this? What if we have a witness? What if we already have a witness? The best possible witness to our identities. One who sees us truly and knows us perfectly. And he loves us because he made us, and because when he looks upon us, he sees his son's righteousness. Third, finally, you can act. You may not feel better, you may still feel inadequate or guilty or anxious, but if you know that you belong to God and therefore you belong to his church and your family and community and creation, you can choose each moment to act on that truth. Make a decision to live sacrificially. Choose to accept the good limits that family and church put on you. Fulfill your duties and obligations in love. Now, in my experience, this doesn't mean that the anxiety goes away, because the rest of society will still treat you as if you are your own. They'll still expect you to live like that. For example, if you choose to pursue a career in your community that it needs, rather than because it comes with prestige or wealth, your relatives might guilt you. They might be disappointed in you. They will probably still believe that your life is a work of art or a story, and you are choosing to tell a rather boring story. But they're wrong. Your life is a part of God's work of creation and redemption. And that is a beautiful story, choosing to live locally and do service to your local community. That's a beautiful thing to do. When and if you choose to get married, you might be warned against it. That happened to my wife and I. When you have kids, people will tell you that getting married and having kids will tie you down. It will hold you back. It will prevent you from living as someone who belongs to themselves. And after you get married, people will still expect you to live like you belong to yourself. Your work will expect you to work long hours, ignoring your duties to your family, to your neighbors, and the church. When you meet someone new, someone who seems like a better partner than the one you already have, society, through movies and quotes and songs, will encourage you to leave your partner and pursue the love in your heart. My point here is that when you accept and believe that you belong to God, the rest of society isn't going to accept it. You will continue to be pressured to view your life as a project. And this is hard. I wish I had a way to fix it, but short of Christ coming again, which is going to happen, but I don't know when, I don't have a way to fix this. But you can persevere. The good news is that when you realize that you belong to God, the unbearable heaviness of the responsibilities of self-belonging are lifted. You just have to fight to keep them off. We need to do this in community, though. So aside from the three things I just listed that we can do personally, we need to create pockets of resistance in our churches, among friends and communities, where we live as people who belong to God and the body of Christ. In my experience, one of the first places this begins is in friendships. As I said, 15% of men have no close friends, and that makes this very difficult. But I believe in the power of friendship. Right now, friends might come easy to you, depending on where you are in your life. But there will come a time when it's hard to make and keep friends, because adulthood in a society that believes we are our own is not actually conducive to friendship. But friendship is where we can most immediately begin to do this work of resistance by encouraging each other. What I want to leave you with is a reminder of the truth. The God of all creation made you. Each moment of the day, he chooses to preserve you. He doesn't need you. He doesn't have to preserve you. He does it because he loves you. This same God knows you perfectly. When he looks on you, he sees not your sins, but the righteousness of his Son. You have nothing to hide from him because you already belong to him. You only have to feel your need for him and rest in knowing that he is the one redeeming all things, not you. You are known and loved. And the real good news is that the meaning and beauty of your existence is not totally up to you. It's a work of grace and love. The real good news is that you are not your own, but belong to Christ. Now our task is to act in love. Thank you.
you, Dr. Noble. As you guys see on the screen, if you haven't done so yet, go ahead and take out your phones. This is the one time we ask you to take your phones out in a church service. Take your phones out and go ahead and scan that QR code, and we'll get started. We'll get started with some questions. If anything prompted you had any questions, promptings maybe about the life you live, or about just your friends, neighbors, coworkers, people around you that you're interacting with, anything that you think might be helpful that you want to ask more about, we're going to go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to look over here, and I think that first question really is a good question. What are some good diagnostic questions to ask in order to understand if I see myself as my own?
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the things to look at would be how you're affected by events that happen in your life, right? What makes you anxious, what makes you depressed, the kinds of things that affect your self-esteem, the kinds of things that shake you. I think those would be ways of evaluating that. I would also say to take a look at when you're making big decisions. Are you considering, do you imagine yourself as trying to create a great story, or are you trying to think about how you belong to God and to other people and how you can best serve them? So an example that comes up to a lot is I'm working with students. They tend to be highly anxious about choosing the one right career. They have the idea that there is one right career out there for them, and that career is going to give them justification and purpose. It's also going to help shape their identity. And if they don't find that one right career, then they're going to fall apart, that their life is not going to have purpose and meaning. So when I talk to students like that, that tends to be a diagnosis that I can make. That anxiety that they feel is not just the anxiety of, well, I'm growing up, I'm becoming an adult, I have to get a job. It's actually the anxiety, the fear that there's an existential, my life itself depends on finding the one right purpose and career for the one right thing for my life. And what I usually end up telling them is, you live in the modern West, there are many good things that you can do. So pick one of those very good things and honor God by doing them. And that's hard for them to grasp. But that's one way I think we can do something like that. But I also think we can evaluate the way we use social media. I think that can be helpful. I didn't talk about the way belonging to others affects us, but I would say the way we use time would be a good diagnostic. If we really belong to God, then we belong to His church, and we belong to our neighbors, and we belong to our family. When we conceive of our lives and the way we spend our time, does that belonging reflect reality? Okay, the use of our time, does it reflect the fact that we belong to others, or are we really just thinking about our lives as fundamentally our own, and our time is fundamentally our own?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's something a lot of us in here can identify with, right? We have a multitude of choices before us in almost anything we do. A career is one example, but just even every day when we wake up, it's kind of like, I need to make the best choice. And we live in a day and age where we kind of can make the best choice, but that does kind of help us identify, what is my goal really after here? Like, what am I really trying to accomplish? Trying to live the good life in a way that Jesus didn't describe, and oftentimes that's usually the case. So I want to ask a question to follow up kind of on that. That kind of implies that to some degree, we need to be okay with not always having the best thing, and maybe we're going to make the wrong decision, or it's not going to be the absolute best. And I know you spoke to that, but speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and this is one of the things I counsel students on regularly, is that you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Your task is to be faithful to the wisdom God's given you and to act. Choice paralysis is a serious problem that affects us because we have an almost limitless number of options available to us. We can freeze, we can become paralyzed with all the various choices. And that's why I said I think the best thing to do is to find the options that are good, that are honoring to God and benefiting to your neighbor, and then pick one and just do it. And if you get down that road and you discover, I'm not really good at this, then you can just do the same thing. Find some other good thing to do with your life and then do that good thing. I get afraid when people are so anxious about finding the one right thing because, in my opinion, that's when they get stuck and don't do any good thing.
Yeah, it almost feels like a sense of legalism, right? Like I
Absolutely.
have to do this exact right thing to feel right and justified.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's go to another question here. What would society look for us to not be trapped in a bear cage? This is a good question, and also touch a little bit on like what societies in the past, like has this been an issue? So they're asking, what does the true human affirming society look like? Is it possible? Has it existed in the past?
Yeah. So I'm going to do that, and I'm also going to address the next one too. Have you experienced or observed a community of friends? I'm going to actually answer both of those together because I think that gets to it. So on the history question, has there been another time in history? I'm not a historian, so I don't know the answer to that. And but my theory is this: every civilization, every society has had some. And I can't prove this, so don't ask me to do it. But my hypothesis is that every society has had some malformed understanding of what it means to be a human. It just differs based on the society, right? So slaveholding America had a very different disordered anthropology than contemporary America has its disordered anthropology. That's my hypothesis. Can't back it up, so take it for what it's worth, which is not very much. What does it look like to live in a society that affirms what it means to be human as God actually designed us? Heaven comes to mind. That's actually the answer. Outside of that, we're just doing the best that we can. On the practical level, I think it means having people in your home, and that's why I'm answering that second question as well, the next one as well. I think it means churches. I think one thing it looks like is churches where the regular practice is people coming and just spending time with each other in their homes, having meals together, not even official things. Like official things are great too, like small groups or life groups or whatever groups, however it's, described, termed. But just having people in your home with no agenda, but just loving people and having them in your home. Realizing that you have obligations to them. And that's one way of doing that, because when you do that, inviting them into that personal space, I find that you begin to build bonds with each other, and all of a sudden you're introduced to their life problems, and now they become your problems, and now there's ways that you can love them, and it's reciprocated, and it's a powerful thing. And that's very counter to the way that we feel that our homes are places that we retreat to and close off from the world. So that's one thing it would look like. It would look like businesses that would still strive to be productive and profitable, but they would also do things like provide natural lighting, even if it's not efficient. I mean, not always looking for efficiency is the final good. Efficiency is a good thing, but when it's over other goods like truth, beauty, and goodness, righteousness, it's a problem. And that happens all the time in our society. We allow efficiency to trump everything else. So that's just a sketch. I think I would have to write a novel, like a utopian novel, to answer that question, really, wouldn't I? Right? Like it's the entire society. I don't know if I can. So that's why I want to hang my hat on that. Having friends because that's what I've experienced. To answer that second question, that's what I've experienced. I had some friends who would just spontaneously after church, why don't you come over to our house? And we go over to their house, and they had like 1 million kids, and the house is a mess. And not like a disgusting mess or something, but they were like toys, right? Because it was a lived-in house. And it wasn't like a presentation or a show. It was just a real house. And we felt safe, we felt loved, we ate a meal together. We would bring over some beans and they'd have tortillas and we would just like throw together a meal, and it was like last minute, and it was beautiful. And I felt like I belonged to them, and it broke down some of those barriers that society has encouraged me to build up. And so to me, that's one of the most powerful, intimate, practical practicable things that we can do.
Yeah, so be in community, but be in an authentic community, because if we're going to be inauthentic in community, all we're doing is promoting. Like, I have to, in order for me to be around you and for you to come to my house, I have to present in this such way. And so somebody walks into that and they're thinking, well, I got to do this. And now you're just promoting that.
That's right. And often we have agendas when we have people over. Like we got some specific goal that we're networking, or we're trying to get our kids to play together, or we're doing something. Do it leisurely. Just invite someone over, because it's really nice to be around other people, especially other believers, especially people in the church.
Okay, so this goes nicely into the next couple of questions, really. So the question is, Protestants have a heavy tendency towards individualism, especially compared to Catholics or more Orthodox denominations. Do you think Protestants have the resources to effectively encourage members to be less individualistic and combat the idea that we are our own? So I guess I'd like to hear you, with that question, answer how our church is promoting, because that's another question on here, how our church is promoting the idea that you are your own, how our church is promoting the lie without realizing they do it, and what can churches do to counter that?
Specifically church. Okay, so I'm going to address this as churches and then as Protestants. So as far as Protestants go, I mean, I wrote a book. I'm here. I'm trying. I don't know I'm Protestant. I don't know what you want me to do. I'm doing my part, guys. I don't know. I'm pushing against it.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. That's great. Well, I'm trying. It is. Individualism in Protestantism, there's some deep roots. But, Catholicism there's plenty of Catholics who have completely bought into individualism. So I would push back on that a little bit. If American individualism, if you're in America, it's hard to not have it in your blood. It doesn't matter what religious tradition. Protestantism, does it have more individualism in its roots? Okay, sure, maybe. But I don't think there's anything uniquely. We're all struggling. We're all drinking the same water. But the question of churches, how do churches do that? Well, sometimes church services can be highly individualistic. They can really be about the individual coming and experiencing something, the individual getting something from it and then leaving. Especially churches where worship is a show and the preaching is a sort of TED Talk. It can just be about what's in your head and not about actually a community worshiping together, taking communion together, confessing together, greeting one another, bearing each other's burdens. The church is communal. It just is. It's built into the DNA of our faith. So there are lots of ways, even the way some churches will advertise appealing to your individuality, to your sense of identity, to what you think of yourself. If you want to be hip, come to our church, that sort of thing. It's rampant. And so to address that, we just need to get back to the means of grace, the basic things that we do. The Lord's Supper, singing together, listening to the word, greeting one another, confessing our sins to each other, those kinds of things.
Can you talk a little bit, you kind of already addressed this, the idea of just being faithful. And so sometimes there's that idea, like to go along with how churches promote this, sometimes there can be that idea that if I'm not doing something extreme in my faith, my faith either isn't good enough, strong enough, whatever, when really what is God calling us to? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Say that one more time.
So the idea that maybe we have to do big and extreme things to just within the church. So we just take that and plant that in the church. That idea that we find in culture, how do we combat that? What does it actually mean to be faithful?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the culture is going to incline us to think in terms of what corporate America looks like and what popular media looks like. And those things mean slick, high-quality production, big scale, attractive people, those sorts of things. And even when we think about doing mission projects, right, we're going to be tempted to think in terms of large-scale things because we are a nation that loves to do massive things. And we get excited about big projects. But the most important thing is being faithful where you are right now to you, to your neighbors, and to your local church. That's also the hardest thing to do. It's actually pretty easy to do big-scale things because you can get excited about it, and when it fails, you can just write it off and do another big-scale thing. It's really hard to live with people in community for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, to stay their friends, to help them move, to mentor their children, to love them, to guide them through grief and sorrow and happiness and childbirth and death. That's really hard, but that's the faithful work that we need to be doing, and that's what it means to belong to one another. That's also going to be a tremendous witness to the world because you know what? The world feels terribly alone, just like a lot of us feel terribly alone. And if we can be spaces where that kind of community is happening, that's a resistance. That's something different. That's something I want to be a part of. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and we'll get to a question in a second, but to continue on that train of thought, you had a quote, I believe it was from a poem, talking about all that is my responsibility is the trying.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
T.S. Eliot,
yes.
yeah. For us, there is only the trying, the rest is not our business.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways I think about faithfulness. T.S. Eliot, in 4 Quartets, he says, for us, there is only the trying, the rest is not our business. And that often is what helps me get through very difficult things, remembering that for us, the task is to try. God is the one responsible for the outcome. And we just need to be faithful. We just need to be faithful. What's challenging about that is for contemporary Americans, we want to think about efficiency. And so we want to say, the trying is never enough. I need to be highly productive. So what has been the most proven method to produce, number of people in my church or, missions work or whatever it is? And what Eliot is reminding us is that our task is to do what is good and beautiful and true, and the rest is not our business. And sometimes that means that we do things that don't turn out to be massive successes, but they were still good and true and beautiful, and they needed to be done. Doing the right thing doesn't always have a massive, you don't always get a parade for it. You still got to do it.
Do you think there's a temptation in there for that to just lead to laziness at all? Like, I can't change anything anyways?
It could. It could lead to a kind of quietism where you say, I can't really do anything. But the key is, for us, there is only the trying. So you still have to try. Mm-hmm. You still have to try. The difference is that you know that you're not saving the world. Christ is redeeming all things, not you. Your task is to be just faithful in the square inches that he's given you. And he's given you a lot. And you can do a lot of great things.
Okay, that's good. All right, we're going to jump slightly to a different topic now.
Yeah.
I find this is a good question. I find tension between a desire to express who God made me uniquely to be, like believing that we are uniquely and individually created. Can you? So I find a tension between a desire to express who God made me uniquely to be and who God created me to be. Can you speak to this topic?
Yes. Yeah. So. Self-expression. So I think the tension here is between a worldly self-expression, which is desperate, right? And expressing the good things that God has made you. God is a great creator. He made you. He's preserving you every moment of your existence. It's miraculous. Your existence is miraculous. He's given you talents and gifts. And it's honoring to God for you to excel in those gifts. And expressing them is a good thing to do. What is it? Is it Paul or is it Christ who talks about doing good works so that people will praise God in heaven? I should know this, but I don't teach Bible.
That's Sermon on the Mount, Jesus.
Yeah, that's Jesus Christ.
It's him, yes, that one. That Jesus. You got it.
Thank you.
You got it.
I'm not, that's fine. For us, there's only the trying. For the rest, God help. Yes, so I think to me, that's the model, right? You express yourself through the work that you do that is excellent, right? So if you're great at a sport, if you're great at basketball, and you express yourself through being excellent at that sport, there are ways of doing that honors God in heaven, and there are ways of doing that honors yourself. If you are an artist, it's the same thing. If you're a teacher, it's the same thing. If you're a poet, it's the same thing. If you love certain music, there's a way of sharing the love of that thing that invites other people to love it, right? Think about a food that you really love. Okay, a food that you really love, and it's a part of the way God designed you. You love food. You love cooking. And so you invite people into your home and you share that goodness with them. And it's contagious. They come to love the thing that you love because you love it rightly. There's a way of doing that invites people in and blesses them and honors God. And then there's a way of doing that where it's all about creating an identity, where you're just trying to brand yourself as the guy or the lady who's really good at cooking. And so I guess I would ask, I think a good way of sort of testing ourselves is, are we expressing ourselves through love, in order to bless other people, or are we doing this to build ourselves up, to make ourselves feel like we exist in some way?
Those diagnostic questions that somebody asked earlier are good for understanding when are we trying to express ourselves as a way of like justifying our existence. Those diagnostic questions are good. It's like, how do I respond if I don't receive what I'm looking for? How do I respond if I don't get that affirmation back? Those are really good. But all of this, I think, really does require a lot of self-examination, a lot of like stopping and pausing and asking yourself, maybe at the end of the day, like, what happened today? How did I respond, and why did I respond that way? And really being honest with yourself before the Lord.
That's right.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let's see. Okay, well, perfect. What are some techniques to rest without rest itself being a technique? So let's spend a little bit of time there. Like, what is rest? What is good rest? What's the difference between biblical, godly rest and like a lazy rest? What's the benefit of it, and how do we do it?
Yeah, so I love this idea. Rest is actually really difficult for us because when we think of rest, as I said earlier, our temptation is to think that we are going to rest in order to be productive. So I can take a nap if when I wake up, for me, I'm able to grade more efficiently. If I'm too tired, I need to take a nap so I can wake up and grade efficiently. This is often how we think about the Sabbath. We think about the Lord's Day. We think about the weekend in general. The weekend is to recharge so that we can do real life. And so the weekend becomes this space where we recharge in some way. Sometimes rest can become frantic. We have to hurry up and have adventures or do things or go places or go boating or play things or fix things. So that we're even productive when we're trying to, quote, rest. I've got to watch all the latest movies, right? I've got to catch up on my TV show. And pretty soon, resting becomes another chore that we have to do, another way of being productive, another way of maximizing our efficiency, another technique, really, fundamentally. So that's not biblical rest. Biblical rest is when you can accept that God is sovereign and in control of the universe and not you. And you can just be still. So, when I read to my daughter, who's 7, A worldly kind of rest, because this is a fairly restful thing, would be for me to say to myself, this is a good thing to do because studies have shown that if you read to your child, their vocabulary will be improved by 10 points. I made that up, but it's probably true anyway. I don't know what the points represent, but points. Percentage points, let's say. A leisurely or a restful way to read to my daughter would be to read just because it's lovely to read to your children. Maybe it benefits them in some, maybe it'll help them become smarter or something. That's fine. Okay, whatever. But that's not why you're doing it. And if it turns out that it's not true that it benefits them by 10 percentage points, you still read to them because it's lovely. Because it's lovely. That's restful. When I talked about having people over to your house without an agenda, I think that's a kind of biblical rest. Without an agenda. We're not trying to accomplish something. We're just trying to enjoy and delight in somebody else's company. Hanging out with friends is a way of resting if it's done not with some particular agenda in mind, but just resting in God's sovereignty and delighting in the beauty that's before you. I think a good test for us is, can we be still? Can we be still? I mean, how many of us are watching TV and on our phones at the same time, right? Like we can't even, yeah. It depends on the show, right? Like if it's not very good. We can't even do one distraction at a time. We got to do multiple distractions at the same time. Why is that? Well, can we just rest? Can we just stop and be alone with ourselves? And what's scary about being alone with yourself is you feel like I've got to hold my life together. My life has got to be significant. My life has got, if I'm alone with myself, I might discover some really bad things about myself. Like I'm inadequate, like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, like I ought to be doing some other things. All of those thoughts, put them on pause and say, God is sovereign, God is in control of the universe, not me. I can just sit and be still. All right? That's biblical rest. And that's very difficult to do for me.
Yeah, I mean, personal experience. So I had my summer vacation this summer, and I go on the vacation, and I instantly start making a list of everything that would need to be done on this vacation or in order for me to come back restful. And like, if I don't do this thing, then I won't have maximized it, right? And it just filled me with so much anxiety. I'm like, what am I doing? This is foolish. But again, not having heard this and read the book yet, it was just anxiety inducing until I realized I couldn't do that and actually be rest. It wasn't contributing to the rest. But realizing, man, that's not the kind of rest we're after. I really am just trying to maximize something and be efficient.
It's so hard because technique has a moral power to it. If you're a parent, you feel this a lot because in parenting, there are so many techniques that are given to you. Here's the proper way to potty train your child. This is the one proven way to potty train your child. This is the one proven way to teach your child to read. This is the one proven way to teach your child to clean their room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each one of those is like a moral boulder put on your shoulder. Because what it feels like is if I don't use this method, I am failing my child. And they are going to be less successful. And the world is hyper competitive. And I'm barely keeping my head above water. So what chance do they have? And you just feel worse and worse and worse. And the same thing can happen with the vacation, right? Why aren't you maximizing your vacation? There are guides online that tell you how to do Disney World the one right way. Yeah. If you're not doing that, then you're not going to have a good time. So you better write all of those things down and maximize it down to a minute. And like that's not restful. It's an awful way to live. But again, what I want to emphasize is efficiency is not bad in and of itself. But what I'm pointing out is that when you have an entire culture that is overwhelmingly obsessed with efficiency, it puts this moral burden on us that is just awful. It's just awful.
Yeah, another example of rest, something we do for rest is exercise, right? Fitness stuff.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, it's good stuff, right? But not too long ago, I saw a social post that said 50 fitness tips. and immediately thought of your book. I'm like, man, 50 things that I've got to do to like actually, I'm nowhere close to doing these things. And just the anxiety that built in. Right, exactly. Start with one. But that's just a good example of starting to call out the lie and recognize it and see how many times you're on social media and you see like 10 things to accomplish this. 5 things you're supposed to be doing here, or just like something put up as an example that you're supposed to be. And you're just receiving these, and the people in your lives that you know and love, your kids, your neighbors, your coworkers, are just receiving these daily. Like, this is who you must be. This is what you must do. These are the 50 things you must do to get the most out of your fitness. Yeah.
This one's a hard question.
Yes. How do we practically help our kids who are struggling with anxiety? That's a pretty open question.
So I'm just going to give, I'm not a medical professional or a psychiatric professional, so I can't give professional advice on this. I'm just going to speak from my heart. There are so many different reasons why we feel anxiety. Some of them, the best thing is counseling. I think some of them, one of the things that we need are for our kids are mentors. I think we need mentors in our children's lives. It's great for them to come to us. We want them to come to us and to talk to us about our problems. But I've had college students say to me that one of the things that they desire the most and they feel missing in their life is a mentor. They just don't feel like they have older people that they can turn to as mentors, which just was heartbreaking to hear, frankly. I was like, I'm right here. You know where my office is. What's going on, guys? But they mean more than just one teacher. But I think that's helpful. I mean, we got to talk about screens and social media. I mean, the reality is that there's plenty of evidence that social media, particularly used in excess, particularly certain forms of social media, they're just toxic. Instagram, TikTok is just, it's not a safe place, in my opinion. It's not a safe place. It can suck you down some pretty horrific rabbit holes and can introduce you to what I talked about earlier, this sense of hyper competition. When you're young, you're so insecure. It's so hard to feel secure with yourself. And I know I would have been an absolute train wreck. I would have been a mess if I grew up with today's social media. Like when I was a teenager, I would not have been in a good place. I had AOL, Instant Messenger. And I'm still not in a great place either. It still wasn't very good. But it was like chat rooms. I think Zero Boy was my screen name.
You wouldn't care to explain where you got that
Nope.
from?
Nope. Anyway, we just got to be realistic about that. I mean, and that's not a fun conversation to have, but I think it's a reality. It's destructive, and I think there are healthy ways to use social media, and it's important to teach our kids that. But there are some platforms that I think just should not be used because I think they're toxic and we've got to be careful about that. So those are things. We need to tell our kids that we love them and that they have a safe place to talk and that God loves them no matter what. One of the things I like to tell my children is that no matter what they do or say or think or feel, no matter what happens to them, I will always love them. I think that's a good thing to say to your children. I don't know, that's not going to wipe away their anxiety, but I think that will help. And we talked about pointing out the lies of society, these lies that you have to be your own, that you have to create your own identity and have your own purpose. We've got to be places where we're helping our kids see that. Like, oh, this person, this corporation, this artist, this whatever, this billboard is telling you this. It's not true. we've got to be able to say things like that to help correct the way people think.
So I started doing that with my 6-year-old daughter, and every time a commercial comes on, she says, "What lie are they?" Or to some effect, "What lie are they trying to sell us this time, Daddy?" And a commercial,
Yes.
But a commercial comes on, and I'm like, she asks, and I'm like, actually, they're trying to sell you Jesus. It was like, that one's actually not a lie. There's commercials. Have you seen those? He Gets Us. Those commercials.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that one's actually about Jesus. Not a lie, sweetie. Anyways, I think that's such an excellent point. I think there's so much there, so much that we can do as a parent, but actually being a safe place where they can share any emotion and be accepted and safe with you. And I think there can be kind of a, like maybe sometimes we want to be gospel-centered homes, but functionally we're not. And our kids aren't safe to be who they are and to struggle with us. And that's just, that's something that every parent feels a lot of times out of fear of wanting our kids to be okay and all right. And then it becomes not safe for that kid to be there. And that goes deep, but I love what you said there. I think that's really good. So why don't we give a hand to Dr. Noble. Thank you, Dr. Noble.
Thank you, guys.
It was excellent. Well said.